They thought he was just the delivery guy, easy to ignore, easy to mock. But what they didn't know was that he had been watching, learning, and planning his move. One day he walked back through those same doors, not with a package, but with the power to change everything. Dorian Matthews had been making deliveries in downtown Phoenix for almost a decade. He knew every alley, every service entrance, every receptionist who barely looked up when he dropped off a package. The work wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and he took pride in doing it well. Most people saw him as just another uniform, someone who blended into the background, someone who didn't matter. And at Whitmore and Klein, a sleek high-end marketing firm with marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows, that attitude was especially strong. The first time Dorian walked through those glass doors, he had expected nothing more than a routine drop-off. But he quickly noticed the way the employees looked at him, like he was invisible or worse, something to be dismissed. The receptionist barely glanced up as she signed for the package, already moving on to something more important. That was fine. He was used to that. But over time he started noticing more, the whispers, the smirks, the way some employees chuckled when he walked past. At first, he told himself it was nothing, just his imagination. Until it wasn't. One afternoon, as he placed a delivery on the counter, a voice cut through the office noise. "Man, can you imagine if the delivery guy was our boss?" Laughter followed. Dorian didn't turn around, but he felt the heat rise in his chest. He recognized the voice. Ryan Caldwell, one of the senior account executives, always dressed in tailored suits, always cracking jokes loud enough for others to hear. Another voice chimed in, this time a woman's. "Please, he's probably used to lifting boxes, not leading meetings." More laughter. Dorian kept his face neutral, giving the receptionist the tablet to sign. She handed it back without a word. He had dealt with worse. He had spent years learning how to ignore this kind of thing. But something about this moment stuck with him. It wasn't just the words. It was the confidence behind them. The certainty that someone like him could never be in charge. He walked toward the exit, passing rows of glass-walled offices where employees sat at sleek desks sipping overpriced coffee and pretending to work. Some glanced at him uninterested. Others barely noticed him at all. Just another delivery guy. Just another man passing through. But as he reached the door, he caught his reflection in the glass. His uniform, his delivery scanner clipped to his belt, his hands rough from years of lifting boxes. They saw him as nothing more than that uniform. And for the first time in a long time, that bothered him. Outside, the Arizona sun was blinding. He climbed into his van and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. He wasn't angry. Anger was fleeting. This was something deeper, something sharper. They thought they knew who he was. They had no idea. But soon they would. Dorian wasn't the type to dwell on things. He had dealt with his share of disrespect over the years. People talking down to him, assuming he was uneducated, acting like he was invisible. It wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising. But something about that moment in Whitmore and Klein stuck with him. That night, after finishing his last delivery, he parked his van outside his small apartment in Mesa. The place wasn't much. One bedroom, old carpet, a kitchen with cabinets that had seen better days. But it was his. He sat there in the dark for a while, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the glow of a street light outside his window. He had spent years telling himself it didn't matter what people thought of him as long as he worked hard and made an honest living. But tonight, that logic wasn't holding up. The laughter at Whitmore and Klein wasn't just ignorance, it was certainty. Those people truly believed they were better than him. that someone like him could never be in a position of power. He needed to talk to someone. Dorian grabbed his phone and called the only person who had ever truly understood him, his older brother Malcolm. Malcolm picked up after 2 rings. "Yo, you good?" Dorian asked. "I'm good. What's up with you?" Dorian hesitated. "Had one of those days." Malcolm chuckled. "Let me guess. Some rich folks made you feel like you weren't supposed to be in their space?" Dorian exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Something like that. Yeah, well, ain't nothing new." "It's not," Dorian admitted. "But today was different." Malcolm didn't rush him to explain. He never did. He just waited. "They laughed," Dorian finally said. "Like outright laughed at the idea of me being anything more than a delivery guy." Malcolm went quiet for a moment. "And that got to you?" "It did." Another pause. Then Malcolm said something Dorian wasn't expecting. "Good." Dorian frowned. "Good. Yeah. Means you're finally tired of it." Dorian sat back, staring at the dashboard. "What am I supposed to do? Quit my job because a couple of idiots don't respect me? Nah. But you're smarter than that. Smarter than them too." Dorian let those words settle. He had always been good with numbers, strategy. When he was 16, he had turned a couple $100 into a few thousand by flipping sneakers. Later, he got into investing, stocks, small businesses, even real estate deals. He understood the game better than most. But he had never gone all in. Malcolm's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Remember what Dad used to say? When people only see you one way, you've got 2 choices. Prove them right or prove them wrong." Dorian exhaled. "Yeah, I remember." "Then what you gonna do?" Dorian didn't answer right away. He was thinking about Whitmore and Klein, the expensive suits, the arrogant smirks, the way they had laughed at the idea of him being anything more than a guy who dropped off their packages. They saw him as small. And maybe up until now, he had been thinking small. He looked at the worn steering wheel beneath his hands, then at the dashboard where a stack of delivery invoices sat. This wasn't all he was. He knew that, but they didn't, and that needed to change. Because proving them wrong wasn't going to happen overnight. But it was going to happen. Dorian wasn't just a delivery guy, not really. That was the part of himself he let people see. The part they assumed was all there was to him. But behind the uniform, behind the routine drop-offs and worn-out work boots, there was another side of him, one that very few people knew about. Because while they spent their days crafting marketing campaigns and crunching client numbers, Dorian had been running numbers of his own. He had always had a mind for business. Even as a kid, he had found ways to make money. When other kids spent their allowances on toys, he had been flipping sneakers, limited editions, hard-to-find releases. He knew exactly when and where to buy them and, more importantly, who was willing to pay double, sometimes triple, for a pair. By the time he was 20, he had moved on to cars, buying and selling used vehicles, learning how to negotiate, how to spot a deal before anyone else did. He invested in stocks, started putting money into small businesses. He never flaunted it, never talked about it. But he watched, he learned, he built. And over the past year, something even bigger had been brewing. Dorian had been sitting on a business proposal, one that had caught the attention of serious investors. People who weren't interested in where he came from or what he did for a living, but in what he knew. They saw his potential. They saw how he analyzed businesses, spotting their weak points, understanding their value before anyone else did. And now they were ready to back him. He had been meeting with them in the evenings after long shifts, late nights spent on Zoom calls, poring over financial statements, refining his strategy. He had already helped turn around 2 struggling businesses quietly, efficiently. No one at Whitmore and Klein would ever suspect it, but they were about to find out. One evening, he sat across from his lead investor, Anthony Wells, in a private lounge at a downtown hotel. The place was sleek. Leather chairs, dim lighting, the quiet hum of business deals being made over expensive whiskey. Wells was a sharp, no-nonsense businessman who had built his fortune in commercial real estate. He didn't waste time on people who weren't serious. "So tell me again," Wells said, sipping his espresso. "Why Whitmore and Klein?" Dorian leaned forward. "Because they're in trouble, and they don't even realize how bad it is." Wells raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Dorian pulled out a folder from his briefcase, flipping it open on the table between them. "They've been bleeding clients for the past year. Bad leadership, outdated strategies, spending money in the wrong places. They look successful on the surface, but their debt load is suffocating them." He tapped the papers. "I give it 6 months before they either downsize or sell." Wells studied the numbers, flipping through the pages. "You're sure about this?" Dorian nodded. "I've been watching them for a while. Their biggest accounts are pulling back. Their client retention is dropping. They're relying on reputation, not results. And that's catching up with them." Wells smirked. "And you want to be the one to buy them out?" Dorian didn't hesitate. "I don't just want to buy them. I want to turn them around. Restructure. Cut the dead weight. Bring in fresh talent. Make them profitable again." Wells sat back, tapping his fingers against the table. "It's a bold move." "It's a smart move," Dorian corrected. Wells chuckled. "You've got confidence. I'll give you that." He took another sip of his espresso, then set the cup down and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a check and slid it across the table. Dorian looked down at it. The amount was exactly what he needed to make the first move. "You've got my backing," Wells said. "Don't make me regret it." Dorian picked up the check, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it. The people who mocked him had no idea they were laughing at their future boss, and soon they were going to find out the hard way. Dorian knew patience was key. Buying a company wasn't like buying a car or flipping a stock. It required strategy, precise timing, and knowing exactly when to strike. He had spent months studying Whitmore and Klein's finances, learning their weaknesses, tracking their every misstep. The company wasn't just struggling, it was sinking. On the surface, they still had the sleek office, the polished brand, the illusion of success, but underneath it was chaos. Their biggest clients were scaling back. Their expenses were out of control, and their leadership had no idea how to fix it. Dorian wasn't the only one who had noticed. Rumors started circulating in industry circles. Whispers about potential layoffs, talks of restructuring. Some employees could sense it. Others were in denial, convinced that their firm was untouchable. But Dorian knew the truth. With Wells and the other investors backing him, he began making moves quietly, strategically. The first step was securing the shares. Whitmore and Klein wasn't a publicly traded company, but it had multiple stakeholders: former executives, private investors, people who had put money in years ago and were now desperate to get out before things collapsed. Dorian approached them one by one, making offers they couldn't refuse. At first, some were skeptical, a delivery guy buying into a major marketing firm? But money talked, and Dorian had the leverage. One by one, they signed over their shares. It took weeks, late-night meetings, careful negotiations. But by the time the paperwork was finalized, Dorian held the controlling interest. He owned Whitmore and Klein. The last step was making it official. The current CEO, Richard Langford, was a man who had built his career on old money and good connections. He wasn't particularly smart, just lucky. And luck had finally run out. Dorian scheduled a meeting. No warning.
No pretense.
Just a direct email to Langford's assistant. Subject: immediate discussion required. The assistant, a woman named Ellen who had worked at Whitmore and Klein for over 20 years, blinked in confusion when she saw Dorian's name in the sender's field. She had seen him drop off packages dozens of times. Why was he emailing the CEO directly? She knocked on Langford's office door, stepping inside carefully. "Sir, I just received an urgent email from Dorian Matthews." Langford didn't look up. "Who? The delivery man?" Ellen said hesitantly. Langford's fingers paused over his keyboard. He let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You mean the guy from the lobby? What could he possibly want?" "He's requesting an immediate meeting." Langford leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. He was already in a foul mood. Profit reports were looking grim, and their largest client had just pulled their contract. The last thing he had time for was nonsense. "Fine. Bring him in," Langford muttered, waving a dismissive hand. "Let's get this joke over with." By the time Dorian walked into the Whitmore and Klein office that morning, the energy in the building had already shifted. There were murmurs, glances exchanged in the hallways. The receptionist, the same one who had barely acknowledged him for years, suddenly sat up straighter when he entered. Langford was waiting in his office, clearly irritated. He didn't even stand when Dorian walked in. "What's this about?" Langford asked, barely glancing up from his computer. Dorian took a seat across from him, setting a thick envelope on the desk. "It's about the fact that, as of this morning, I own the majority of Whitmore and Klein." Langford finally looked at him. He frowned, then let out a short, dismissive laugh. "You? That's impossible." Dorian didn't blink. "Check the paperwork." Langford hesitated, then grabbed the envelope, pulling out the documents. As he flipped through them, his face lost color. He looked up again, this time with something different in his expression. Panic. "This is a joke," he muttered. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Dorian leaned back in the chair, calm. "I think I'm your new boss." Langford slammed the papers down. "This firm isn't for sale." "It was," Dorian said smoothly. "You just didn't know it." Langford's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at the numbers again as if trying to find a mistake. But there was no mistake. The realization hit him like a brick. He wasn't the CEO anymore. Dorian stood up. "I'll give you until the end of the day to clear out your office." Langford stared at him, speechless. Dorian turned toward the door, but before he left, he glanced over his shoulder. "Oh, and Richard." He let a small smile cross his lips. "Don't worry. I'm sure there's a delivery job out there for you somewhere." Langford's face turned red, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. The office would never be the same again. And for the first time in years, Dorian Matthews wasn't just passing through. He was in charge. Dorian knew that taking over Whitmore and Klein was one thing. Making sure everyone understood what that meant was another. As he walked out of Langford's office, the murmurs in the building grew louder. Employees shot glances at each other, whispering behind cupped hands, confusion written across their faces. They had seen him before hundreds of times, but never like this.
No uniform.
No scanner clipped to his belt. Just confidence in his stride and ownership in his presence. Some recognized the folder he had carried into the CEO's office, and when Langford's door slammed shut behind him, A few people stood up from their desks, trying to piece together what had just happened. Dorian ignored the stares. He had something more important to do. He turned to Ellen, Langford's longtime assistant. She was watching him carefully, her expression unreadable. "I need the entire company in the main conference room," Dorian said. 10 minutes.
Ellen hesitated.
She had worked for Langford for years, but she had also seen firsthand the cracks forming in the company. She glanced toward the closed office door, then back at Dorian. "I'll send the email now," she said. Minutes later, the employees of Whitmore and Klein shuffled into the sleek, glass-walled conference room, murmuring among themselves. Ryan Caldwell, the same senior executive who had laughed about the idea of Dorian being in charge, leaned over to his colleague and scoffed. "What is this?" Ryan muttered. "A security briefing?" His friend smirked. "Maybe they're laying off the cleaning crew." The joke stopped when Dorian stepped to the front of the room. No one sat down. No one spoke. The silence stretched as he looked around, meeting their eyes. Some looked confused. Others looked impatient. And a few, like Ryan, still looked amused. Dorian finally spoke. "I'm sure you're all wondering why I called this meeting." A few exchanged glances, shifting on their feet. "As of this morning," Dorian continued, "I am the new majority owner of Whitmore and Klein." A ripple of stunned silence moved through the room. Someone let out a small, disbelieving laugh, as if waiting for a punchline. It never came. Ryan folded his arms, smirking. "You're joking." Dorian turned his gaze to him, his expression unchanging. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Ryan's smirk faltered. Dorian set a thick stack of documents on the conference table. The financials, the contracts, every signed deal that made this possible. He gestured to the papers. "If anyone has doubts, feel free to take a look." Nobody moved. The weight of reality settled over the room. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a mistake. Dorian Matthews, the man they had ignored, the man they had laughed at, was now their boss. For the first time since stepping into that building, Dorian allowed himself a small pause. He let them sit with the moment, let them process it. Then he spoke again. "I've worked in this building for years. Most of you never noticed me. Some of you did, and made sure I knew exactly what you thought of me." His gaze flickered briefly toward Ryan. "I remember every joke, every insult, every time someone assumed I didn't belong." Ryan shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. "But I also remember something else," Dorian continued. "I remember watching this company make mistake after mistake. I remember seeing potential wasted because leadership refused to adapt. And I remember thinking that if I had the chance, I would do things differently." He took a step forward, his tone unwavering. "That chance is now." A nervous energy filled the room. People who had been standing with arms crossed slowly unfolded them. Others who had been leaning against the wall straightened. Dorian glanced around the room, then let his next words land with precision. "Things are about to change. Some of you won't like it. Some of you won't be here for it." Silence. Dorian gave them a moment to absorb that before continuing. "But for those of you who are willing to work, who are willing to be part of something stronger, something better, you'll have a place here." He let his eyes sweep the room one last time. "This is not the same company it was yesterday. And it's definitely not the same company it was when I walked in here as a delivery man." Another pause. Then with a calm authority that left no room for doubt, he finished, "If you don't like that, there's the door." The weight of his words settled over the room like a final verdict. And for the first time, the people in that office realized Dorian Matthews wasn't just passing through. He was here to stay. The conference room was thick with silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The reality of what had just happened settled in like a slow-building storm. Dorian could see it in their faces. The disbelief, the unease, the subtle glances exchanged between employees who just moments ago had felt untouchable. Then finally someone broke the silence. Ryan Caldwell let out a short laugh, a bitter hollow sound. He shook his head, crossing his arms. "This is insane," he muttered. "You can't be serious." Dorian turned his gaze to him, steady. "You think I'd stand here and say all this if I wasn't serious?" Ryan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "So what? You come in here, throw your weight around, and we're all just supposed to fall in line?" Dorian didn't blink.
No.
"You're supposed to do your job. If you can't handle that, you're free to leave." Ryan scoffed. "Right, because you of all people are suddenly the expert on running a firm like this?" Dorian took a step closer, his voice unwavering. "I know this company better than you think, Ryan. I've spent years watching you all operate, watching the arrogance, the wasted potential, the outdated strategies. And I've spent even more years learning how to run businesses successfully." Ryan clenched his jaw. "You're making a mistake." "No," Dorian said calmly. "The mistake was assuming I didn't belong here." A few murmurs rippled through the room. Some employees looked at each other, uncertain. Others, especially the junior staff who had been ignored by upper management for years, seemed almost intrigued. Dorian let the tension settle before continuing. "Let's talk about mistakes, actually," he said. He pulled a folder from the stack on the table and flipped it open. "Ryan, since you seem to have so much to say, maybe you'd like to explain why your department is responsible for one of the largest client losses in company history." Ryan's face darkened. "That's not." "It is," Dorian cut in smoothly. "And I have the reports to prove it. Overpromising, under-delivering, failing to adjust strategies when the market shifted." He tapped the folder. "The client walked, and took millions in revenue with them." Ryan's face burned red. Dorian shut the folder. "So if we're questioning who deserves to be here, I'd say you have a lot more to answer for than I do." Silence. Ryan's mouth opened slightly, as if he wanted to argue. But he didn't, because he knew the numbers didn't lie. Dorian took a deep breath and turned his attention to the rest of the room. "This is the part where some of you start to panic, where you start wondering if you're about to lose your jobs." He let the words linger for a moment before continuing. "And the answer is, some of you will." That got their attention. Dorian gestured towards the documents in front of him. "I've already done my research. I know who brings value to this company. I know who's been skating by. And I know who's been taking credit for other people's work." Some people visibly tensed. Others stole glances at their colleagues, as if suddenly realizing the consequences of their office politics. Dorian continued, "There's dead weight in this company, and I don't carry dead weight. If you're here to do your job, to work, to contribute, to help rebuild something stronger, you have nothing to worry about. But if you're here just to collect a paycheck and keep up appearances," he shrugged, "you won't last long." He let that settle before delivering the final blow. "I'll be sending out termination notices by the end of the day." The room felt like it had lost all its oxygen. Ryan took a step forward. "You can't just—" "I can," Dorian said simply. "And I will." Ryan's jaw clenched. His pride wouldn't let him be the first to back down. He straightened his tie, lifted his chin. "Fine. If this is how it's going to be, then I quit." Dorian met his stare. That's the first good decision you've made in years. Ryan scoffed, shaking his head. He turned and stormed out of the conference room, slamming the door behind him. A heavy silence followed. Dorian let the moment breathe, then turned to the rest of the staff. For those of you still here, remember this: Whitmore and Klein isn't just going to survive. It's going to become something better than it ever was before. But that only happens if the right people are in place. He let his gaze move across the room, taking in the reactions. Some nervous, some determined, some still processing what had just happened. If you're willing to step up, to work, to actually build something meaningful, you'll have a place here. Another pause. But if you're only here because you think you deserve to be, because you're comfortable, because you think nothing will change, he gestured toward the door, you can follow Ryan. The room remained silent, but this time it wasn't shock. It was realization. Things had changed. Dorian wasn't the man they had dismissed anymore. And from this moment forward, he never would be again. By the time Dorian left the conference room, the energy in the office had completely shifted. Some employees sat at their desks in stunned silence. Others whispered in hushed voices, stealing glances at the man they had ignored for years. Some looked afraid, others looked intrigued, and just a few, looked inspired. Dorian didn't let any of it affect him. He had done what needed to be done. Now the real work began. As he stepped into what was now his office, formerly Langford's, he let out a slow breath. The space was bigger than he had expected. Leather furniture, bookshelves lined with unread business books, a massive oak desk that probably cost more than his first car. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. This moment was supposed to feel different. He had spent months, years, even working toward this, fighting against every assumption, every dismissal, every time someone had underestimated him. He had made it. He had proven them wrong. And yet, standing here, staring at the skyline, he realized something. This wasn't about revenge. It had never been about that. If it was, the satisfaction would have faded by now. He would have felt the high of proving them wrong, of watching Ryan storm out, of seeing the looks on their faces when they realized the man they had mocked now owned everything they stood on. But that feeling wasn't what drove him. He had done this because he knew he could build something better, not just for himself, but for the people in that office who had been overlooked, dismissed, underestimated just like he had been. There were people in that building who had talent, people who had ideas, people who, under the right leadership, could turn this company into something great. And there were people who didn't belong there anymore. He had spent years learning that respect wasn't given. It was taken, earned, built with action, not words. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Ellen, Langford's former assistant, stepped inside hesitantly. "Everything all right?" she asked. Dorian turned from the window, nodding. "Just getting used to the view." She gave a small smile. "I imagine it looks a lot different from this side." He studied her for a moment. She wasn't like the others. She had been in this company long enough to see its rise, its mistakes, and its slow decline. "I have a question for you," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "All right. Why are you still here?" Ellen folded her arms, considering. "Because I love what this place used to be, and I think under the right leadership it could be that again." Dorian nodded slowly.
Ellen hesitated.
"If I'm being honest, I didn't expect this. I've seen a lot of CEOs come and go, but I never thought I'd see this company end up in your hands." Dorian chuckled. "Neither did they." She exhaled, shaking her head with a small smirk. Langford's gone. Ryan quit. There's a lot of uncertainty right now. There always is when change happens. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Well, for what it's worth, I think this place could use some change. Dorian smirked. Then let's get to work. As she walked out, he turned back to the window. Change was coming, not just for Whitmore and Klein, not just for the employees still trying to wrap their heads around what had happened, but for him, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't just proving himself. He was leading, and this was only the beginning. The lesson was clear: never underestimate someone just because of where they start. Because one day they might be the ones signing your paycheck. Never underestimate someone because of where they start, because the person you're ignoring today might own everything you stand on tomorrow. In a world that praises titles and overlooks hustle, stories like Dorian's remind us that grit, vision, and patience will always rise to the top. If the story moved you, inspired you, or made you think twice, subscribe for more powerful stories where the underdog doesn't just rise. They take over.